Life.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Politics Show with me, Puru, and Councillor Andrew Wood. We finished off last week with a rebellion kind of ish of 12 Labour councillors writing a letter which was published about concerns over the budget. So today's show is about the budget in terms of what the extra money is. Do we have extra money? What can we do with that extra money? Where did it come from? And some of the options as well in terms of the services affected. And we're going to discuss the concerns raised by the councillors, just because it's out there in the public domain. It's just good to explain it. So stick with us while we go through the budget and how it affects you and what the issues are. So join us after the break. Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome back. Today's show is a special show just on the budget. So Tower Hamlets Council every year have a special meeting to basically set the budget. So the budget answers two questions: what the level of the council tax is going to be, and what that money is going to be spent. And we finished off last week dramatically with messages going around with a letter that was being distributed on social media by councillors expressing their concerns and indicating that there's extra money. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrew. Andrew, do you want to explain where this extra money came from? Because you actually tweeted on this. Is it like we've got 20 million extra to play with? Am I correct?
Yeah, so if you also add other money that we knew about already, we think that for this year alone, there's an additional sort of £28.93 million. And some of that we knew about in last December, but most of it is actually new. So the main elements of it is that last year, when I say last year, I mean the financial year. An important point to make is the financial year goes from April to March. So this financial year, the government have given Tower Hamlets Council £63 million in additional funds to deal with COVID. But we only spent, and the forecast, we're only going to spend about £55.5 million of that this year. So actually, for this financial year, we're going to have a surplus of £7.5 million of money that the government gave us that we haven't spent yet. And we weren't, well, I suspected that was the case, but that wasn't confirmed in December when the budget was put together. On top of that, the government have given us another £4 million in sort of a council tax supplement, because people obviously won't be able to pay council tax if they've lost their jobs. Again, that's a one-off. They've also given us what will arrive in April will be another £13 million of grants for COVID, which is non-ring fenced, which means we can use that £30 million on whatever we want. And then on top of all of that was then sort of £7.6 million of something called New Homes Bonus, which has been an important source of money in the past. And we're going to get £17 million in the next financial year. 10 of that is already committed to other, but there was £7.6 million left. And the letter last week from the 12 Labour councillors was very much focused on that £7.6 million. And they were sort of saying, let's spend reversing some of the savings that have been proposed, and also reducing council tax. So rather than council tax going up by 4.99%, they're saying let's have it only go up by 4.5%, and all together that adds up to £4.6 million for 1 year. So the argument we're kind of making is that on one hand we've got £28 million more money than we thought, or that we've got spare, and we're only talking about spending £4.6 million to meet the objectives of what the 12 Labour councillors put in their letter last week. So it's still extremely prudent. Most of that money will either be spent on other things or can be put into reserves. We're not sort of saying we should spend all of it, because probably the key issue about the budget is not so much this coming financial year from April, it's actually the subsequent years, and the council being particularly concerned about some of the income that we get in the future years. And that's driving this much more than just what's happening in the next year.
So just to give a comparison, because so like millions of pounds, we normally read about it in the sports page for say a Premier League footballer, so like 7 million or 14, 13 million or 20 million. But do you want to just give a comparison as to what that actually means? So, for example, how much does our youth service, for example, cost us a year? Just so listeners could understand, would just like a comparison of what that money means, or then that allows us to discuss the options that are available on that.
I mean, so there are different components to the youth service, and it has been reduced over the years. But there's about £1.5 million. It's the latest budget number for the youth service, and another £1 million that we kind of spent on kind of youth offending teams. But to give you an idea of the overall shape of the budget that we're talking about, it's about £360 million in total that the council are proposing to spend next year, or this next financial year. So when we talk about, maybe £28 million being available, that's about 7 to 8%. And even the £4.6 million, I mean, that's quite a small percentage of the £360 million in total that we're spending. So we're not talking about huge sums of money, but to give you an idea, so that the library service cutbacks they're proposing add up to £1.6 million. I think the total library service is about £6 to £7 million in total. So when we talk about £4.6 million, we're talking about almost the full cost of the library and the ideas services. So we're not talking about huge sums of money, but these are sort of cuts that have been proposed in this year, and really the key issue for this year is an argument about future years, and it's basically a question is, do we use some of our financial reserves to kind of push back or delay these savings programs where we have to cut council services until we know more about what's happening to our budget in future years and the threat of working from home. And part of the problem is that this is an impossible time to be setting a budget. I do have a great deal of sympathy with the council and with the mayor. Trying to set a budget in December just before another lockdown was incredibly difficult. And one of the arguments we'll be making on Thursday night is, let's give it a few months. Let's see what happens to the vaccine rollout. Let's see what happens to the number of COVID deaths. Let's see what happens from the working from home threat. We've also got threats in terms of business rates, and that's dependent on how many people go back to work in their offices. And I think we'll know a lot more about the shape of the future, come late summer, so maybe by September. So one of the arguments is let's not make these decisions now, because, for example, next Wednesday, the Chancellor is presenting his budget, and it may be that he says something which is positive, or he may say something that's even more negative than we fear, in which case we'll have to do even more cuts than we've already proposed. But we just don't know yet until next Wednesday. So the argument we're kind of making is, given that we've got this additional £28 million, let's spend some of that money to delay some of these cuts until we have a firmer picture about what's happening.
So just to explain to the listeners, when the councillors meet to set the budget, so it's actually the councillors that actually set the budget. So we're a bit like the mini parliament. So just like parliament votes on the finance and then the government spends the finance, the council chamber, it's the councillors who actually vote on the financial package, and then it's up to the mayor and his executive to actually spend it. So when we actually meet, we actually make three decisions. One is the rate of the council tax, how high are we going to increase it or decrease it. The second one is basically the spending, and the spending is very detailed it's basically a 3-year program that we basically continuously roll. So it's not just the current year spending. You've got the current year spending, but we also vote on how we're going to spend or save in the coming 3 years, and that's something called the medium term financial strategy, or MTFS. So I've one of the ideas that you were mooting, Andrew, was to actually review that. And I just want to explain why the council does that. It just helps us plan things. So if departments know in advance that they have to spend the money or they have to save it, there's a lot of planning that needs to go on. So once that's apparent, then the various heads of departments could make the appropriate actions in terms of hiring or letting go of staff, sort of ish. But Andrew, you were sort of like hinted that because of the uncertainty that we shouldn't tie ourselves into a 3-year plan, and that there needs to be some flexibility in that. Is that correct?
Yes, it's something. Yes, so very similar to that. So the argument is that we normally look at the MTFS, in detail once a year, and then we sort of update the next 3 years and the next 3 years, and then kind of what I'm kind of suggesting is actually we almost have to do the budgets like every 3 months, so every quarter. So the suggestion is that we sort of do a mini budget, after the end of Q2, which is August. So in September. And I think in September, a lot of these issues will be a lot clearer than they are today, and we'll have a better feel for, what the impact is. Because one of my concerns is that once you close a service, it's really hard to restart it. And the history of Tower Hamlets finances for the last few years yes, government cuts have cut back, our budgets. But what we've also been, relatively, good at or getting extra money from is obviously council tax increases, because every year, with the exception of 2018, we've been applying the maximum possible council tax increase. So the council tax budget income keeps going up, and also new growth. So all of those new residential buildings, which are now opening on the Isle of Dogs or in Poplar and other places, new people are now paying new council tax for the first time. And then we've had new homes bonus, and new homes bonus has paid us £189 million in 2011, and it's been a very important source of income for us. And one of the problems that we've got, and the reasons why there's so much uncertainty, and the other thing we've had lots of money from is business rates. But the problem is that in the subsequent year of 2022, the government are looking at changing the rules on business rates, which may be really negative for us. But they may also phase in those changes. And our budget assumptions is that, we have this cliff edge where basically we lose a lot of money in 1 year. They're also assuming that new homes bonus completely ends in the sort of that following year as well. And it may be, that it might not end, or the government might replace it with something different. And we may not get as much money as we've had in the past, but we may still get some more. We just don't know yet. And the other key issue for us, is something called business rates revaluations. So a lot of our income, about 40% of the total income that we get at Tower Hamlets Council, comes from businesses paying, in effect, a property tax. And Canary Wharf is obviously a very valuable area, and people pay quite high taxes to occupy some of those office towers. The problem is those office towers have been pretty much empty for the last year. And if that were to continue in the future, the owners of those towers would basically say, these are not valuable towers anymore because they're half empty, and therefore we should be paying less tax. And they will ask the government to reevaluate their taxes. And because we take a share of that tax, if that were to happen, and if Canary Wharf were to continue to stay largely empty, that would have a catastrophic impact on our finances. And that's not actually in the budget. So it is entirely possible that come September, if those things go ahead and the offices are still empty, that actually we have to make even more cuts than already being proposed this year. But again, we just don't know yet.
So basically, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that probably explains why, say, the administration or the current administration in Tower Hamlets Council want to save as much money as they can so they could plan ahead. What they don't want to do is end up in a situation with, say, Croydon Council, where because of a few issues, all of a sudden they found themselves literally bankrupt, and the government had to appoint external commissioners to come in. And that's the kind of level of uncertainty that we're operating. So it's going to be a really interesting meeting. So after the break, we're going to come back, and what me and Andrew will do is we'll just discuss the forthcoming budget meeting. It's something that you could watch, etc., but we'll just explain what actually happens in that and the kind of options that are available at that meeting that are going to be discussed. So join us after the break for a breakdown of Budget Meeting 101, Tower Hamlets. Hi everyone, welcome back after the break. So in this section, Andrew and I are going to discuss the forthcoming budget meeting. So it's a meeting that people could tune into. The papers are available as well. So if you go on the council website, it's next Thursday. But it's an interesting meeting because it's not like your typical council meeting. Is literally my understanding is, and Andrew, if you correct me, is basically a proposal is put forward by the mayor, and all the councillors have an opportunity to discuss it. And in theory, on paper, any councillor could put their own proposals forward. So and that's called a budget amendment. So it will be opened by the finance lead member for finance, Candida Rowland, who would actually propose the motion, and probably Mayor John Biggs will second it, and then every councillor gets an opportunity to discuss it and give their opportunity to change it. Yourselves, as part of the Conservative group, put a budget amendment. So do you want to just discuss what your point of disagreements are with what the administration is proposing, or the current mayor John Biggs? So what he's proposing is there for everybody if they go on the council website. Do you want to just talk through how you go about, or anybody else who wants to challenge or put an alternative budget proposal, and just talk about what you're thinking of your approach to what's being proposed?
Yeah, so I think probably any councillor, certainly the Conservative group, of which I'm a member, even though I'm not a Conservative Party member anymore, will submit probably on Tuesday an amendment to the mayor's budget, and it'll basically sort of say is that we want to make these changes to the budget. And what's unusual about this meeting is that all the votes are recorded separately. It's called a roll call vote. So normally, on a minor matter, you stick up your hand or something. But in this particular case, is the clerk will read out the name of each councillor, and each councillor will say, yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. And that's recorded. And so that's one of the changes that have been made in previous years, is because this is pretty much the only time that councillors actually have real power in a council meeting, because we still have an executive mayor model of government. In effect, the mayor has all of the power. And the one exception where councillors have some power is over the budget. So if 2/3 of councillors reject the budget, then basically the mayor has to go back and sort of change it. And again, if 2/3 disagree, he has to keep going back and changing it. So in effect, the councillors have a power to vote down the mayor's budget and force the mayor to submit a new one. And what will be in the calendar, there will be a sort of a second meeting a week after Thursday's meeting, which starts at 7 o'clock. So if it is rejected on Thursday night, it then goes back to a second meeting. That's never, from memory, I don't think that's happened in recent years. But in theory, that's what would happen. And in theory, we might go to a third or a fourth meeting if we continue to get stuck. So that's one of the things that will make Thursday night very interesting. In terms of the amendment that we're working on, and I actually wrote a draft this morning, I pretty much laid out already what our concerns are, which is the council, and I can completely see their point of view, and it's a very prudent, financially low risk option, and I can understand that, and I understand the concerns of finance officers as well. Is, let's bank this extra money, let's put it into reserves, because we don't know what's going to happen. And it may well be that, that some of these business rate revaluations happen, in which case we're going to need that money, and we need to start cutting the budgets now. And the argument we'll be making is we just don't know that yet. And we do have extra money. We still have healthy reserves. We're still a long way from Croydon. So let's basically delay some of those cutbacks until we are on surer ground that we know that we absolutely have to do that. And I'm not sure that's quite the case yet. And we're not talking about a year's delay. We're talking about maybe a 6-month delay till September. And the other points to make about the history of Tower Hamlets is generally the council has not been good at sticking to its budget. So if they say they're going to spend £350 million, they end up spending more than that, they normally miss it by 10 to 50 million pounds. And I know the finance team sort of viewpoint is that, you only have to miss that budget by 10 or 50 million pounds a year for 3 years, and that converts what is a very healthy financial situation with lots of reserves into not such a healthy situation. And if on top of that you have business rates revaluations, then you could go quite quickly. And Croydon kind of went within about 3 to 4 years from being, in a pretty good financial position to being, in effect, taken over by government to some extent. And I think that's their concern. But our budget assumption assumes that the council will, for once, actually, stick to its budget. And if they do that, and if people do start going back to the office, and if the government are more generous, and to be fair, the government have been generous over the last year in terms of this additional money they've given us, like the £13 million we didn't know about last December, then it may be that we don't have to cut back as much as the current budget is proposing.
And so just to explain to the listeners, if anybody who wants to, say, propose an amendment or challenge the budget that the mayor puts forward, they have to be signed off by the financial officers, because there's strict rules governing council budgets. We have to pass a balanced budget, so you have to have the money to spend it. If you don't have the money to spend it, then you as councillors, we get charged for the difference. I think you're prosecuted. So that's why everything has to be signed off, so to speak. But we've got the letters from the 12 councillors that came in, so like last Friday. Has there been any movement on that? I haven't seen any changes. This administration seems to be sticking to its financial plan. Have you heard anything on the grapevine? You've been talking to the finance officers.
So I haven't. So all I've got for definite is the letter that was published last Friday with 11 specific proposals, and we've made sure the finance team were aware of that as well. And we've been talking to the finance team because, as you just said earlier, is that when we submit our budget amendment, they basically have to check that it is correct and legal and is providing a balanced budget. And if they thought we were submitting a budget amendment that wasn't, that they could reject our budget amendments. Obviously, what we're trying to do is talk to them in advance and make sure they're aware of what it is that we might submit when we submit it on Tuesday, and what the detail is. But we're also obviously incredibly curious to hear back as to what's happened with these 12 Labour councillors' proposals. And to be, my first version of a budget amendment actually looks pretty similar to what they wrote anyway, that we would have tried to reduce council tax increase to lower than 4.5%, something closer to sort of 3%. But other than that, there were going to be a lot of similarities. But I haven't heard anything official. My understanding is there may be a sort of a Labour group meeting on Monday night. I don't know. And the other difficulty that we have is obviously the Chancellor is speaking on Wednesday, and we have to submit this on Tuesday. I think I might have to double check that. So we might have to submit this before we've even heard what the Chancellor has to say.
No, it is. But I just want to explain to listeners, although we're councillors, each of our political parties have different rules, and I know the Labour Party is quite strict. So in the 80s, if anybody reads Ken Livingstone's biography, he never applied the whip, and all the Labour group meetings were out in the open and journalists could come, and he followed the principle, look, if people believe in something, they'll vote with it, and that's it. And he used to get his budgets through. And then came this gentleman, Neil Kinnock, and he brought in these really strict rules with regards to councillors. So especially on the budget, if a Labour councillor does anything contrary to what's been decided, and they get into a lot of trouble, and it's an immediate, according to the rules, it's an immediate suspension. And if people cast their memories back 2 years ago, according to the newspapers, something similar happened to me and another councillor, according to the newspapers. So that it's very strict. So in theory, councillors can make individual decisions, but in practice, as soon as we join a political party, each political party has specific rules when it comes to councillors, and there's sanctions if you break those rules. So I presume that's why the councillors have stayed stumpf about the leaked letter and haven't spoken about it. And it'd be interesting to see if that collective decision changes. I haven't seen any papers or anything like that from the administration indicating any change. So it looks like they will be sticking to their 3-year plan, which is what's called a medium-term financial strategy. But any last thoughts on this, Andrew? Before we go to a break, do you anticipate any changes or any unexpected events happening at the meeting?
So it's hard to tell, but I think one of the reason for those tweets as well is to actually, because when they wrote this last Friday, I think they were only aware of the £7.6 million of new homes bonus. And what I'm so saying to people is actually there is more cash available than that. There is, there's 7.5 million from the extra money from government. There's a 30 million and a 4 million. So we have more money than we thought. And the question really, I think, for the Labour group is, do they in effect want to bank all of that as insurance against things going really badly wrong in the future, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do? Or do they want to spend some of that money, and I'm not suggesting they spend all of it, on basically sort of delaying some of these savings programs until we're absolutely sure? Obviously, as an opposition group, this is much easier for us. Peter Goals and I are the only two members of the official opposition group. Obviously, we have Councillor Rabina Khan as well on her own. So this is a lot easier for us. We just basically pick up the phone and agree with each other what we're going to do, as we were doing earlier today. But this is, important services at stake. And the other important point is there are lots of jobs at stake here, because, for example, a library savings, they're talking about cutting 35 jobs. These are, people's jobs and incomes and families at stake here. And the argument we're going to be making is, don't do this until you're absolutely sure that you need to do it. And I don't think we're there yet. We may be in 3 to 6 months' time, and maybe we have to cut more, as I said, but I don't think I'm not yet 100% convinced of the need to make all of these cuts in the way that the mayor is proposing.
Or there could be, as Tony Blair said, a third way out of it, where we could agree on something and then review it, and then according to the greater climate, with central government making clear what their views are and knowing which way the economy is going, we could make a much more informed decision. So there's two options. There's possibly a third way where everybody could come together and agree on a compromise, and then basically move forward like a wait and see approach. So we never know. The mayor is one of the most canniest political players I've come across. The ball's in his court as to what he does in this situation. We're going to go off to a break now. And after the break, Andrew and I are going to just discuss some of the savings options. One aspect is the library, which Andrew has led the campaign on and spoke about. And the other aspect is the cuts to public health, mainly in the drug service. And I'll talk through that from my experience in the criminal justice system. But join us after the break, and we'll talk through some of the options or savings or services cuts that are being proposed. Hi everyone, welcome back after the break. So in this section, Andrew and I are gonna discuss some of the savings options or service cuts to services that are being proposed by the mayor in his budget. So I'm gonna let Andrew talk about a large portion of it, which is to do with the library service. Now, Andrew, you've actually spoke on that on recently at an event led by the union. So do you want to just talk about what those actual cuts mean in terms of members of the public, in terms of the libraries or their access to the libraries, and what it actually means for those communities? I know that you were concerned by the Isle of Dogs, and the Isle of Dogs just has one library, which is Cubitt Town Library, that serves that entire area. So do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a sort of campaign that's kind of formed and involves the unions, because the proposals were originally and still are talking about, I think, roughly sort of 35 job losses. There's then the actual changes to the libraries themselves, which obviously affect sort of kind of local residents as well. So there's kind of been a campaign organised by some people. So what happened was, so at the end of last year, the council made some proposals to save about £1.6 million from library services. And what they were proposing at that point in time was to close completely Cubitt Town Library, to reduce the hours of Bethnal Green Library to, I think, about 15 hours a week. Watney Street Market to also reduce hours to, again, about 15 hours a week. And at the other ideas stores would sort of have reduced hours on Sunday, so going from, I think, 6 down to 4 hours. There was then a consultation. Lots of people responded. I think about 700-800 people responded to that consultation. Obviously, the unions have got involved. So a couple of days ago, the cabinet papers came out for next Wednesday, and the council are proposing something different from the first proposal. And they're kind of offering kind of two options. So the first option basically would be pretty similar to what I just said, but some slightly longer hours for Bethnal Green and Watney Market. But for Cubitt Town Library, rather than closing completely, it reopened for 2 days of the week for a total of 16 hours. But that would still save £1.6 million. And then basically what they were going to do is reduce the amount of evening staff cover at the ideas stores for the rest of the week to kind of pay for that. The second option they're looking at only saves £1.5 million. And that's pretty similar, but that would allow Cubitt Town Library to also open on a Saturday as well. So they're kind of gone from completely closing Cubitt down to it's sort of rather than being 6 days a week, it might be 2 or maybe 3 days a week that's open, which obviously is welcome. But both options still result in major job cuts. So I know the unions, and I had a chat with them earlier. Obviously they like the fact that Cubitt Town stays open, but they're still concerned about the job losses. And one of the proposals in the 12 Labour councillors' letter was to reverse completely the library savings. And that was also something that we were aimed at, because one of our concerns on the Isle of Dogs is, I don't know if you looked in our direction recently, but there's lots of, big, tall residential towers, and people are moving into them like now. And we may have lost Tiller Road Leisure Centre. We were going to lose the library. So it's really odd. You've got all these new people, massive population growth, and actually the services are kind of being cut back. And I forgot to say, and if you're in Whitechapel, you don't have to worry, because you're going to have a new library. So as part of all of these changes, is the council are actually also proposing a brand new library in the town hall in Whitechapel, and keep the existing reference library in Whitechapel. So Whitechapel would have 2 libraries, and us poor people on the Isle of Dog, and there are lots of poor people on the Isle of Dogs, by the way, would lose our library. We'd still have the Canary Wharf Ideas store, but it's not that accessible for residents. It's the smallest of the ideas stores, and it's not ideally situated either. So it looks like there's been some improvement, I think, thanks to the consultation responses. And I think also the quality impact assessment on the libraries, I think, was also, if you've heard us speaking about those issues, was also, I think, influential in changing the council's mind on this one as well. But it still involves, big changes in the library service. So, and I know the unions will also have something to say about this on Thursday night as well.
No, but they're still sticking to the financial plan. So it's a small victory, but it still leaves a bit of uncertainty. Do you think the future of Cubic Town is guaranteed, or do you see that library eventually up for the chop, so to speak, and we just end up with one central library in Tower Hamlets? Is that where you think the direction is going?
So our concern about the 2 days a week is that's just setting it up to fail, because then people just forget which days it's open, and therefore you'll just get cut at some point in the future. In theory, what's supposed to happen is if the Asda site gets redeveloped, then in theory on that site would be a new sort of public facility. And then what would happen is that the Canary Wharf Ideas Store and Cubic Town Library would both move into that new big facility at Asda, and then basically would have one big library on the Isle of Dogs. But Asda doesn't yet have planning permission. This is like the fourth attempt in 15 years, I think, to do something on that site. The previous attempts never quite worked out. And even if it were to get planning permission this year, and even if it were to go ahead, probably 6 years before that new facility be ready anyway.
No. It's an amazing campaign, and I know there was a petition out, and there was an event. I want to slightly move the topic away from the other large area of cuts, which is cuts to the public health budget, which is to do with drug treatment, and it's an issue that's not talked about in Tower Hamlets. It's probably due to the kind of individuals who benefit from the service, the kind of demographics who just fall through the cracks of our public institution. But there are deep cuts to that service, and just looking at the savings proposals, there's a £450,000 deduction from the substance misuse service, and there's and the decommissioning of the Royal London Hospital Violence Reduction Project Health, which is another £102,000. But just looking at the public health budget overall on the MTFS, they're expected to deliver more cuts in second and third year. And I just want to give the context of what it means in Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets has one of the highest number of heroin and crack cocaine users, and the last statistics we've had on the issue, we've got the equivalent of about 3,200. That's for every 100,000 population, that's 14.4 people are either a heroin user or a crack cocaine user, and it has impact on other aspects, on their family lives. I've come across many families who've got an individual who's got a drug problem, and it causes issues along that. There's issues with regards to children growing up with parents who have a drug or drink problem. When it comes to domestic violence and violence within the home, that's one of the trigger points, etc., etc. And obviously, it leads habitual users of drugs basically commit petty crime as well, and a lot of the antisocial behavior in the borough is related to and violent crime is related to the drug trade as well. And my concern is that what studies have shown is that whenever there's been an increase in poverty, say a rise in unemployment or financial stress in a population, it kind of like edges people towards either drink or drug issues. And it seems like in a time when we're basically facing economic uncertainty and a lot of people losing their jobs, is it a time to actually cut a service where we're going to have an increase demand. And I just want to give an example. There's been a spike in domestic violence incidences during the lockdown. Is to do with people not having jobs, being stressed out, etc. And we in the courts we had to basically set up a court just specifically dealing with domestic violence cases at Thames Magistrates, and that just shows you how big the problem is. And is it the right time to actually cut a service where we're possibly anticipating an increased demand on the use of that service? And just to give an example, what the drug service does is the ones I come across from Tower Hamlets is the officers go into the police cells, they speak to individuals who are arrested and say, do you want to come off drugs? If they say yes, then they engage with them and put them on a program and help them get off and start rebuilding their lives. Andrew, do you want to give your thoughts on that? Is it wise to basically cut a service where we're possibly anticipating an increased demand on it? It's not a popular service, not one that people talk about, but it's one that's needed in Tower Hamlets.
So I think that there's lots of services that the council provide that people, most people in the ordinary public just would not be aware of until kind of things go wrong. I mean, one of the things to make a point about the sort of public health grant. So the public health grant is about £35 million. And in theory, you can't cut it because it's a ring-fence grant from government for public health. But what you can do, which is what I think is sort of happening here, is how do you define public health? And one of the things that you can do is things that might have used to be spent in a general fund, which is the main pot of money, is you can kind of categorize some of that as being kind of public health. And therefore, you can cut things in public health, but you then have to replace that money with other spend. So to give you, an example, trying to see if I can find the page. So, for example, the substance misuse service is being cut by £450,000, but they're going to spend on physical activity and sports £440,000. So it's almost a one-for-one kind of replacement. But physical activity and sports is the kind of stuff that was done by the leisure centres. So the question is, where was that budget before? Is that a new budget, or are we simply just moving money around? And cutting back what is proper, depending on what your definition is of proper public health spend.
No, it is, and it just, and that's why it's in a time of uncertainty, because once you cut that service back, it's very difficult to build up because you've got officers with years of experience, etc., and it's not something that you could basically build back. So we're going to go into a break. We'll probably continue slightly with this discussion and then move on to Q&A from listeners. But join us after the break, and we'll just continue with this discussion and then go straight to listeners' questions. Hi guys. Welcome back. We're on our final segment, so we're just going to slightly continue with our discussion about cuts to the public health budget, in particular the drug service, and then move on to questions from listeners. So, Andy, just moving forward from that discussion, it is, although is the service users don't talk about the service, the secondary effect of drug use is constantly coming up on the residents' surveys. It comes on top in terms of ASB, in terms of people witnessing the buying and selling of drugs on the streets of Tower Hamlets. So it makes in terms of meeting those resident service demand, it makes more sense, doesn't it, to actually tackle the actual underlying causes than to actually. It just seems counter. It doesn't make sense in terms of we're cutting money from dealing with the underlying services, but we're sort of like increasing money to deal with the after effects in terms of social services, in terms of ASB as well. Just final thoughts on that. Is that something that yourselves have picked up on your budget amendment or feedback from residents?
So we know sort of antisocial. So we know antisocial behaviour is like the top concern of residents. In the last resident survey that was done by the council, and every year it's kind of been increasing in prominence. So it's of greater concern than the affordability of housing in Tower Hamlets, which gives you some idea of how many people are impacted. And one of the things that's happened because of COVID is actually Tower Hamlets, we think nationally, has gone to the top of the number of ASB complaints that are sort of received of any borough in the country. That's partly because we're the densest borough in the country. It's also because traditionally where you had high levels of antisocial behaviour were kind of like the West End, on a Friday night, lots of drunk people, and people obviously aren't doing that right now. So what it has done is moved antisocial behaviour kind of back to more residential areas like Tower Hamlets. So, we have the highest rates in London. The council confirmed that recently. And I suspect also, I know from the data that we have the highest rates in the whole of the country, and therefore everything to do with antisocial behaviour, should be a top priority. I know one of the areas of increase in the budget actually is for the policing teams. So basically, what happens is we give the Met Police extra money, and they give us extra officers at set times, and we kind of tell them what kind of areas that they should be patrolling. So that area has increased. And when you look at the ASB data, it's not all of it, but clearly a part of it is driven by drug use and drug abuse and drug pushes and those issues. So yes, it would make sense to deal with the underlying issues at the same time.
So moving on from this topic, one of the questions I come across when I knock on the doors is complaints from residents about antisocial behavior. That is one of the big issues that I come across when I knock on the doors. Where would people go to, from your experience, what's the most effective way of reporting antisocial behavior or dealing with it?
So this has been a confusing area because there are different routes and different things that you can do. Traditionally, people call the 101 number and then would sort of hang waiting for 40 minutes for that to be answered. So my recommendation is to actually report. So if you go to the Met Police website, there is actually an online antisocial behaviour reporting tool. And my kind of first recommendation is to use that rather than ringing 101, unless you want them, because you're unlikely to get an immediate response with 101. And the second option is on the council website. There's also a separate antisocial behaviour reporting form as well. And my recommendation is, if you have persistent problems, every time it happens, fill in the police report form, because that's then shared with the police and the council. But also, when it first happens, contact the council via their online form as well, because they do have dedicated council officers who look after individual areas. We had a very good officer called Caroline who left recently on the Isle of Dogs, and there's a new officer who's just arrived that I need to get in contact with, so they can maybe deal with some of the more persistent issues. But I know Newham, for example, they have a dedicated phone number, and they also have a bigger group of enforcement officers. So they've put in more resources into this area than we have traditionally. And I think, but to be fair, the mayor has also increased resources. So that team of people I was talking about, at one point, Caroline was the only officer dealing with ASB in the whole of Tower Hamlets. And I know the size of that team has increased, even though they have struggled to retain staff at times.
I think there's a common misconception. So just to explain to listeners, antisocial behavior is not crime per se, and there's a lot of so when it comes to emergency response, it's not something that they would respond to because they would class it as antisocial behavior. It's causing you distress, but there's no actual fear of your safety or of damage to property per se. So it doesn't cross that criminal threshold. But agencies do have tools, etc. One of the things I found quite useful is if you're on a council estate, is to report it to your social landlord, because they have a duty of care. So your social landlord has a duty of care for you to have quiet enjoyment, for you to enjoy. So it does come under their responsibility of you not being harassed in terms of antisocial behavior. And they have tools available. One of the things I've come across is if there is antisocial behavior from a specific property, I have seen sort of like Tower Hamlets Homes do it quite a lot, and other social landlords and other councils is to bring what they call closure orders into the court, where they say, look, no one can enter the property apart from, say, the owner of the property, to move people away from property. So I do suggest another avenue is for you to report it to your social landlord. And I know some social landlords, for example, Poplar Harker, have a dedicated antisocial behavior team who actually deal with those issues. And same with, I think, Tower Hamlets Homes have started, got Park Guard as a service as well. Are there any other routes in terms of dealing with antisocial behavior, and apart from reporting it to the council and reporting it to your social landlord, that you've come across that's quite useful?
Yes, I mean, those are the main routes. And yes, you said that the social landlords as well. And they've also got the power of eviction. So I know people who've been evicted by one housing group for running, drug dealing dens in their apartment. So they do have quite a lot of powers sort of working together. The other thing is sometimes people put their stuff on social media as well, and sometimes that's not appropriate, but sometimes it's quite useful to share problems with other people. I know lots of blocks have WhatsApp groups, so it's also good to talk to your neighbours about some of these issues as well. Talk to your counsellors, because I raise lots of issues. So, to give you an example, there was a theft of a mobile phone. And somebody gave me some private information that they didn't want to, they wanted to remain anonymous, and I passed that on to the police on their behalf. So there's multiple ways of reporting things, but the three main ways are, the police, the local council, and your landlord, and the fourth one obviously is then talking to your neighbours. And I know in some respects, they can get organised and do things as well to some extent. And the interesting thing about Poplar Harker is they're also, like the council, they pay the Met Police extra money. So the Met Police sends special police patrols around the Poplar Harker estates because they've done this deal with Poplar Harker for that extra money. And I think other housing associations could do the same as well if they wanted to. It's kind of like a jointly funding. So they pay some money, and then the Mayor's Office for London pays some money as well. And that basically also buys more police officers who are then dedicated to specific areas.
There's also something called Safer Neighbourhood Teams, which is mainly ward-based, where I know I get invited to it, but I know the chair of my Safer Neighbourhood team, and sometimes I just report things to you. But theoretically, members of the public can attend those meetings and talk about issues. And those are the meetings where the police and stakeholders come together and just think about where they dedicate their resources in terms of police patrols. Do you want to slightly talk about your experience in working with Safer Neighbourhood teams and how
So the Mayor of London has basically made a commitment that each ward should have 2 dedicated ward officers. So these are Met Police officers who in theory at least are basically focused. The only work they do is within the ward. They shouldn't be called off to do other emergency things. That unfortunately hasn't been the case for the last year. In addition to those 2 dedicated ward officers, there should be a PCSO, and then there should be a sergeant. So normally like 3 wards have 1 sergeant. So for example, on the Isle of Dogs, they're based at Manchester Road Police Station. In other areas, I think they're still based at Bethnal Green. And yes, every 3 to 4 months, there's these ward panels of the safer neighbourhood teams that are meant to be led by residents. And one of the things they're supposed to agree in each ward panel meeting is like 3, maybe sometimes 4 priorities for the police to focus on locally. So we had our ward panel for Canary Wharf Ward in January, and one of the things we asked the police to look at was bicycle thefts, because we've had lots of bicycle thefts around the area in recent months. And I've seen the police be more proactive on some of that stuff recently as well. So it does suggest that it works.
Well, we're coming near to the end of the program, but if you do have any further questions on antisocial behavior, you can email myself or Andrew, or contact us on social media, and we're happy to answer questions or signpost you to where you can actually get help with antisocial behavior, because it is something that does affect people's lives, especially when it's done on a regular basis. And it does impact on the quality of life, and it's something that we need to tackle. But we're coming near to the end of our program. Next week, you could join us, where Andrew and I give you the lowdown as to what happens in the budget meeting. Are we going to see a high noon kind of situation, a Mexican standoff, sort of a 3-way Mexican standoff, a bit like the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in the Clint Eastwood movie, or are we going to see something else? But join us next week, where we just give you the lowdown as to what happened. But if people are interested, they can go on the council website. It's next Thursday, 7:00. It's live streamed. Any final thoughts, Andrew, before we sign off on the forthcoming showdown? Have you got any cards up your sleeves?
No, obviously we'll publish our amendment probably Monday or Tuesday. We'll see what happens with the Chancellor's speech on Wednesday. I have heard through the grapevine there's going to be an important announcement in one area. And then obviously we've got our meeting on the Thursday, so it could be quite interesting the next couple of days from the financial side of the council. But, these are also people's jobs on the line as well. So lots of other people will have a great deal of interest in what happens on Thursday night, not just councillors.
Well, join us on Thursday at the council meeting, and then join us the day after, where Andrew and I do a bit of analysis. But thank you again for watching this watching the politics show with myself, Councillor Puru Miah, and Councillor Andrew Wood. And join us next Friday, 7 to 8. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.